They say every Instagram filter has a story to tell. Isabella Morrison's last post told hers, a radiant bride in vintage lace clasping a bouquet of white peonies against the backdrop of a historic Maine lighthouse. Her caption read simply, "Finally found my happily ever after." The post garnered 847 likes in the first hour. By the time it hit 1,000, Isabella was dead. 36 hours after saying, "I do," one of New England's most beloved interior designers plunged 7 stories from her honeymoon suite balcony. Her husband, of less than 2 days, had already cleared out their room, leaving behind only his wedding ring and a phone with its screen shattered beyond repair. The same filter that had softened her wedding photo now cast an eerie glow over the countless tributes flooding her Instagram feed. But there was one comment, posted just minutes before her fall, that stood out among the hearts and well wishes. "You should have kept your promise about the photos." The comment vanished as quickly as it appeared, just like the man she married, just like the life she thought she was about to begin. But this isn't just a story about a bride who shared one photo too many. This is a story about the masks we wear, the secrets we keep, and how in a world of carefully curated moments, the most dangerous filter of all might be the one that blinds us to the truth about those we love. The question isn't just who killed Isabella Morrison. The question is, how well do you really know the person whose photos you double tap? If you're enjoying our content, quickly hit subscribe to join our community and never miss a moment. Let's dive in. Before we delve into the tragic events that unfolded at that luxury Maine resort, you need to know about the 2 people at the heart of this story. Isabella Morrison was the kind of woman who could walk into an empty room and see possibilities others couldn't imagine. At 48, she had built an empire from her uncanny ability to transform spaces and share her vision with the world. To her 89,000 Instagram followers, she was the vintage visionary, the designer who could make history feel modern, who could tell stories through the placement of a vintage mirror or the curve of a spiral staircase. Every day, Isabella shared snippets of her life with her devoted audience. Behind-the-scenes peeks at celebrity home renovations, early morning coffee in her sun-drenched Boston studio, inspiration shots from her travels around the world. Her followers felt like they knew her, and in many ways, they did. Isabella believed in authenticity. She shared her triumphs and her struggles, her design wins and her painful setbacks, but there was one part of her life where the perfectly curated feed fell short: love. The man who would become her husband was a stark contrast to Isabella's open book life. Julian Cross was a ghost who walked among the living. At 39, he moved through Europe's most exclusive art galleries and auction houses like he owned them. Depending on which city you met him in, he might introduce himself as James Crawford, the British investment banker, or Alexander Pierce, the American gallery owner. Each identity was crafted with the precision of a master forger, each story polished until it gleamed like truth. For Julian, photographs were like fingerprints, evidence that could be traced. He had perfected the art of being present yet invisible, of attending the most prestigious events while somehow never appearing in a single social media post. The wealthy women he targeted rarely questioned his insistence on privacy. After all, discretion was the hallmark of old money. These 2 souls, one who shared everything with the world and one who existed only in shadows, were never meant to meet. Their paths should never have crossed. But on a warm spring morning in Venice, fate had other plans. What happened next would lead to a whirlwind romance, a fairy tale wedding, and ultimately a deadly fall from a honeymoon suite balcony, all because of a single Instagram post. But to understand why a man would kill the woman he had just sworn to love forever, we need to go back to where it all began. To that fateful morning at Café Florian, where Isabella Morrison ordered her last first cup of coffee and Julian Cross spotted his final mark. For 20 years, Isabella Morrison had planned other people's forever after. Her designer's eye made her a favorite among Boston's elite brides, transforming ordinary venues into fairy tale settings where love stories reached their happily ever after. She'd lost count of how many times she'd stood in the back of a reception hall, camera in hand, capturing the perfect angle of a first dance while ignoring the hollow ache in her chest. One day, she'd whispered to herself, tucking away yet another wedding invitation into her bedside drawer, a collection that had grown thick with others' joy. At night, she'd sometimes scroll through her Instagram feed, double-tapping engagement announcements and anniversary posts, trying to convince herself that being the architect of others' happiness was enough. It wasn't. So when her assistant Kate fell ill 2 days before the Venice Art Biennale, Isabella almost canceled. The thought of wandering those romantic canals alone felt like salt in an open wound. But Kate had been insistent. The Palazzo Contarini showcase could transform our whole business, Kate had argued from her hospital bed. Besides, she'd added with a knowing smile, Venice is where people go to fall in love. Isabella had laughed it off. At 48, she'd stopped believing in fairy tales. She packed her cameras, her sketch pad, and her practical expectations, boarding a flight to Marco Polo Airport with business firmly on her mind. That's the thing about love. It has a way of finding you exactly when you've stopped looking. Café Florian was a happy accident. It was raining that morning, the kind of soft Venetian drizzle that turned the cobblestones slick and the ancient buildings luminous. Isabella ducked into the historic coffee house seeking shelter, not knowing she was walking into destiny. The cafe was a designer's dream, ornate mirrors, frescoed ceilings, and 2 centuries of stories etched into every gilded surface. She ordered a cappuccino and pulled out her sketch pad, determined to capture some details for an upcoming project. "The light falls differently here in the morning," a voice said, smooth as aged whiskey. "The gold leaf catches it just so." She looked up to find a pair of intense dark eyes studying not her, but her half-finished sketch. Julian Cross stood there in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking like he'd stepped out of a vintage photograph. He asked if he could join her with the kind of old-world courtesy that seemed as much a part of him as his subtle English accent. "I'm something of an art historian," he explained, settling into the chair across from her. "And you've captured exactly what makes this room magical." For the next 2 hours, they talked about art, architecture, and the way certain spaces could hold centuries of romance. He spoke about hidden galleries in Florence and secret gardens in Prague. She found herself sharing stories about transforming historical buildings, about preserving their souls while giving them new life. Not once did he reach for his phone. Not once did his attention waver. In a world of constant digital distraction, Julian Cross was entirely present, entirely focused on her words, her thoughts, her smile. "You see the world differently," he told her as the morning crowd thinned. "You see stories in spaces others pass by." What Isabella didn't see were the calculated glances he cast at her designer watch, her bespoke leather portfolio, the subtle signs of wealth he'd learned to spot like a master hunter. She didn't notice how carefully he'd positioned himself away from the tourist cameras, how smoothly he'd steered the conversation away from personal details. Instead, she saw possibility. She saw mystery. She saw, for the first time in years, hope. When he asked to meet her for dinner that evening, her heart whispered, "Finally." When he suggested a tiny restaurant tucked away from the tourist crowds, she thought it romantic. And when he gently requested they keep their evening private, let's just live in the moment, no phones, no photos, she saw only thoughtfulness. After all, what woman who'd waited so long for her own love story would look for shadows in the light? That first dinner turned into 3 magical days in Venice. Isabella, who had built her brand on sharing every beautiful moment, found herself treasuring these private hours away from her camera's lens. Julian had a way of making the world feel both grander and more intimate, turning each moment into their own private exhibition of life's finest art. "My work takes me everywhere," he told her over candlelit dinners and moonlit walks. "But I've never had anyone to share these places with, not properly." His fingers would brush hers as they walked, each touch electric with possibility. "Would you let me show you?" And show her he did. Over the next 3 months, Isabella's passport filled with stamps from cities she'd only dreamed of visiting. Paris one weekend. "I have an auction I simply can't miss," he'd say, flying her first class to the City of Light. Prague the next. "There's a castle renovation you must see." Then Rome, Barcelona, Vienna. Each trip carefully planned, each destination more romantic than the last. Her followers noticed her absence from social media. Taking some time to find inspiration, she posted occasionally, never mentioning the man who was rewriting her understanding of love. For the first time in her life, Isabella Morrison, who had built an empire on sharing beauty, wanted to keep something precious just for herself. But there were moments, quiet ones, when Julian thought she wasn't looking, where shadows crossed his face. Times when his phone would ring and he'd step away, returning with tension in his jaw. "Business," he'd say with that disarming smile. "Nothing for you to worry about, my love." He was masterful at changing the subject, at turning her questions into opportunities for romance. When she asked about his family, he'd surprise her with tickets to the opera. When she wondered about his past relationships, he'd whisk her off to a hidden vineyard in Tuscany, each deflection wrapped in such exquisite experiences that she barely noticed the answers she wasn't getting. "Privacy is precious in our world," he'd remind her, kissing her temple as they watched another sunset from another stunning view. "What we have is too special to share with the masses. Don't you agree?" And Isabella, who had waited so long for this kind of love, found herself agreeing. She rationalized his absence from her social media, explained away the lack of photos together, justified his insistence on using cash instead of cards. After all, wasn't this the kind of romance she'd spent years helping other women showcase at their weddings? A love so consuming it didn't need witnesses? Then came the night in Santorini, the whitewashed walls of their villa glowing under a canopy of stars. Julian had arranged a private dinner on their terrace, the Aegean Sea stretching endlessly before them. As local musicians played softly in the background, he dropped to one knee. "You've shown me what it means to truly see beauty," he said, opening a vintage ring box to reveal an antique diamond that caught the candlelight like captured stars. "Marry me, Isabella. Let's keep building this beautiful world, just the two of us." She said yes through tears of joy, not noticing how his hands trembled as he slipped the ring onto her finger, or how quickly he steered her away when a fellow guest raised their phone to capture the moment. In less than 4 months, Julian Cross had swept Isabella Morrison into a fairy tale. But fairy tales, as any student of history knows, weren't originally meant to comfort. They were meant to warn. And warnings like wine-dark seas beneath Santorini sunsets can hide dangerous depths. October 20th, 2022 dawned crisp and clear on the Maine coastline. The kind of autumn day that usually filled Isabella's Instagram feed with vibrant foliage and cozy design inspiration. Instead, her account had been quiet for weeks. Her last post a simple, "taking time to plan my own happily ever after," that had left her followers buzzing with speculation. After the fairy tale proposal in Santorini, Julian had moved with surprising speed to plan their wedding. "Why wait?" he'd whispered against her hair as they flew back to Boston. "I know the perfect place." When he showed her photos of the Nubble Lighthouse in Maine, its white tower rising majestically from the rocky coast, Isabella's designer's heart skipped a beat. It was timelessly romantic, naturally dramatic, everything she'd helped other brides achieve for 2 decades. But then came the conditions, each one presented as a gesture of pure romance. "Just family and closest friends," Julian had insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "I want to see your face when I say my vows, not a sea of phones and cameras." He'd wrapped his arms around her from behind, meeting her eyes in her kitchen mirror. "Let's make it intimate. Sacred. 24 guests, no photographer, no social media. Each restriction was gift-wrapped in romance, their love supposedly too precious for public consumption." Isabella, who had built her reputation on sharing beauty with the world, found herself agreeing to a wedding that would go undocumented. Now, standing in the bridal suite of the historic Young's Inn, Isabella smoothed the vintage lace of her gown. The morning light streaming through century-old windows caught the antique beading, creating patterns that begged to be photographed. Her fingers itched for her phone. "Don't you think it's strange?" her sister Marie whispered, adjusting Isabella's veil. 3 months of dating, and I've never seen a single photo of you two together. Not one." Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she pinned her grandmother's pearl brooch to her bouquet. "He's private, that's all. Old money." The excuse sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Old money still has family photos, Bella." Marie's reflection met hers in the antique mirror. "Where is his family anyway?" They both knew the answer. No one had come for Julian. Travel difficulties, he'd explained at the rehearsal dinner, his usual smooth confidence wavering for just a moment. Europe so far, and it was all rather sudden. At precisely 2 p.m., as the autumn sun hung like a golden blessing over the Atlantic, Isabella Morrison became Mrs. Julian Cross. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Waves crashed against the rocks below as they exchanged vows, the lighthouse keeping its steady watch. Julian was perfection in his tailored tuxedo, his words making the small gathering tear up. Yet when Isabella's nephew raised his phone to capture their first kiss, Julian's grip on her hands tightened ever so slightly. The first real cracks appeared at the intimate reception in the inn's historic dining room. Isabella's best friend Lisa, champagne adding courage to curiosity, asked Julian about his art dealing. "Which gallery did you say you worked with in London?" A shadow crossed his face. "I prefer to keep business and pleasure separate, especially today." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Later, as their first dance ended to the soft strains of La Vie en Rose, Isabella's brother David approached with his camera. "Just one family photo," he insisted, "for Mom." Julian's reaction was subtle, a tightening of his jaw, a flash of something dark in his eyes. "Perhaps later," he said, smoothly leading Isabella to the cake cutting. Later never came. That night, in their honeymoon suite overlooking the Atlantic, Isabella scrolled through the handful of surreptitious photos her family had managed to take, each one missing Julian as if she'd married a ghost. "I'd like just one photo of us," she said quietly, "something to remember today by." Julian paused in loosening his tie. "Memories are more precious when they're kept here," he tapped his heart, then joined her by the window. "Trust me, darling, some moments aren't meant to be shared." He kissed her then, and for a moment she almost believed him, almost didn't see how his eyes darted to her phone, still open to Instagram, almost missed the way his hands shook slightly as he suggested they turn in early. After all, tomorrow they'd be heading to their real honeymoon, the luxurious resort at Bar Harbor, just a few hours up the coast, the beginning of their new life together. Isabella fell asleep in her new husband's arms, unaware that in less than 36 hours she would break her promise about the photos, unaware that this single act of defiance would be the last choice she would ever make. Behind her, Julian lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his burner phone buzzing silently in his discarded jacket pocket. The message would go unanswered until morning. "They're closing in. Get out now." The resort at Bar Harbor was everything a luxury honeymoon should be. Their oceanfront suite on the 7th floor offered breathtaking views of the Atlantic, its floor-to-ceiling windows letting in the kind of natural light that Isabella usually spent hours trying to capture for her design projects. That morning, she woke to the sound of waves and the warmth of sunlight streaming across their king-sized bed. Julian was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful in a way that made her heart swell. This was what happiness felt like, she thought. This was what she'd waited all those years to find. Reaching for her phone on the nightstand, Isabella opened Instagram for the first time since their wedding. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she remembered her promise to Julian. But surely, just one photo wouldn't hurt. Just one small announcement to share her joy with the world that had followed her journey for so long. She chose carefully, a simple shot from the wedding, the lighthouse in the background, her vintage lace gown catching the light perfectly. Julian's face was turned just enough to be elegant, mysterious. "Finally found my happily ever after," she typed, her heart racing as her thumb hovered over post. For a moment she hesitated. Then she pressed share. The likes started immediately. Comments flooded in. "Congratulations! You look stunning! So happy for you!" Her phone buzzed continuously with notifications, each one a virtual hug from her community. She was responding to her third comment when Julian's phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the peaceful morning air like a knife. He woke instantly, too instantly, reaching for the device with an urgency she'd never seen before. "I need to take this," he muttered, stepping onto the balcony and closing the glass door behind him. But the morning breeze carried fragments of his conversation back to her. "What do you mean they've seen it?" "No, that's impossible. I told you I had it under control." Isabella watched through the glass as the color drained from his face. His knuckles turned white around the phone. When he turned and saw her watching, something dark flickered across his features. He came back inside slowly, his movements deliberate. The man who stepped through those doors wasn't the charming art dealer who had swept her off her feet in Venice. This was someone else entirely. "Delete it," he said quietly, dangerously. "Now. Julian, it's just one photo." "Delete it!" His shout made her jump. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" He grabbed her phone, his fingers frantically trying to access it. When he couldn't unlock it, his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "Give me your password," he demanded. "Now." Isabella backed away, clutching her phone to her chest. "You're scaring me." "I'm scaring you?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You have no idea what scary is. That post, you've ruined everything." She edged toward the door, but he was faster. His hand caught her wrist, squeezing hard enough to make her gasp. "Julian, stop! You're hurting me." "The password," he repeated. "Give it to me or I swear." She wrenched free, stumbling backward onto the balcony. The ocean roared 7 stories below as Julian advanced, his face contorted with a rage she'd never seen. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Really?" For a moment, something like regret flickered across his features. Then his phone buzzed again, and that momentary humanity vanished. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Isabella clutched her phone tighter as Julian lunged for it. She twisted away, but his fingers caught her wrist. In the struggle, she backed against the balcony railing, its cold metal pressing into her lower back. Their hands fought over the phone, a desperate dance of push and pull. "Give it to me!" Julian snarled, giving one final violent shove. The force of his push lifted Isabella off her feet. Her eyes widened in terror as she lost her balance, her body tipping backward over the 7th floor railing. Her scream pierced the morning air, cut short by the sickening impact 7 stories below. The phone clattered to the balcony floor, its screen shattering on impact. Notifications continued to buzz through the cracked glass, likes and comments still pouring in for a bride who would never read them. By the time hotel security reached their suite, Julian Cross was gone. On Isabella's still open Instagram post, one comment stood out among the congratulations. "You should have kept your promise about the photos." At 9:17 a.m., a groundskeeper's routine morning walk became anything but routine. Through the morning mist, he first thought he'd spotted discarded clothing near the resort's rose garden. The reality would haunt him for years to come. Within minutes, the serene Bar Harbor morning erupted into organized chaos. Police sirens wailed against the crash of waves. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the sea breeze. Detective Emma Walsh stood on the 7th floor balcony, her experienced eyes taking in the shattered phone, the signs of struggle, the single platinum wedding band carelessly dropped near the door. "Married just 36 hours, she muttered, examining the ring. "Tell me about the husband." But Julian Cross had vanished like morning fog. The suite safe stood open and empty. His luggage was gone. The only trace he'd left behind was a single fingerprint on the balcony railing, and a dead bride 7 stories below. The initial investigation seemed straightforward. A honeymoon tragedy, a grieving husband in shock, perhaps wandering the coastline in trauma. That narrative lasted exactly 4 hours until Isabella's viral wedding post reached the wrong person. "Oh my God," a woman gasped in London, staring at her phone. "That's Alexander Pierce." She immediately called the police. In Paris, another woman knew him as James Crawford. In Milan, Christian Dubois. One by one, they came forward. Wealthy women with stories so similar they could have been photocopied. The charming art dealer, the whirlwind romance, the intense privacy about photos, the missing jewelry, emptied bank accounts, vanished lover. But Isabella's death was different. None of the others had threatened his carefully constructed anonymity with a viral photo. Detective Walsh's investigation board grew complex. String connected cities across Europe and North America. Photographs of the same man under different names filled one corner. Bank statements and wire transfers filled another. He didn't count on social media being his undoing, Walsh explained to Isabella's grieving family. Each woman he conned gave us another piece. Their stories stayed in police reports, hidden away in separate jurisdictions. But Isabella's last post, that connected everything. The investigation revealed a sophisticated international criminal network. Julian, whose real name they would later discover was Eric Blackwood, had been running romance scams for over a decade. He targeted wealthy, successful women, preferably with active social media presences. Their online lives made them easy to research, easy to manipulate. The ultimate irony, Walsh would later write in her report, was that his obsession with avoiding photographs, with staying off social media, was what made him stand out. In an age where privacy is rare, his insistence on it became a signature. Isabella's Instagram followers turned into an army of amateur detectives. They combed through years of posts from suspected victims, finding hidden connections. A glimpse of his watch in the background here, a partial reflection there. They flooded the FBI's tip line with potential sightings. But the most damning evidence came from Isabella's shattered phone. In her final struggle, she'd accidentally activated voice recording. The audio captured everything: his rage, her confusion, the final confrontation. His clear words, "You've ruined everything." Her last scream. The international manhunt would take weeks, but Julian's carefully constructed world was already in pieces. The very thing he had tried to prevent, his face being known, had become his downfall. Isabella's last post had gone viral in the true crime community. Every airport, every train station, every port knew his face. But for Isabella's family, for her 89,000 followers who had shared her journey, for the clients whose homes she had filled with beauty, no arrest could fill the void. Her Instagram feed became a digital memorial, each photo a reminder of a life ended too soon. And in Detective Walsh's office, a final piece of evidence sat in an evidence bag, a handwritten note found in Isabella's wedding gown pocket. In her elegant designer's hand, she had written, "Note to self, ask Jay why he flinched when David mentioned London galleries. Something feels wrong." She had seen the red flags. She had felt the warnings. But like so many others before her, she had wanted love more than she wanted answers. On December 3rd, 2022, Julian Cross's game of shadows ended in a small cafe in Buenos Aires. The man who had spent years slipping through Europe's finest hotels was ultimately undone by a barista who recognized his face from Instagram. One quiet call to local authorities, and the international manhunt that had captivated millions came to an anticlimactic end over a half-finished espresso. The trial began on March 15th, 2023, at the United States District Court in Boston. The historic courtroom could barely contain the media frenzy. Reporters from 27 countries packed the benches, their laptops creating a soft symphony of typing that underscored each devastating testimony. One by one, the women came forward. They took the stand with straight backs and steady voices, each telling a variation of the same story. A chance meeting, a whirlwind romance, an insistence on privacy that now seemed less romantic and more calculated with each retelling. "He told me phones spoiled the magic of the moment," testified Claire Dubois, a gallery owner from Paris. "Now I understand he just didn't want to leave evidence." The prosecution's case was methodical, devastating. Digital forensics experts demonstrated how Julian, whose real name was revealed to be Eric James Blackwood, had orchestrated his schemes. They showed the jury his burner phone network, his fake identity papers, the offshore accounts where he'd hidden millions. But it was the audio from Isabella's phone that silenced the courtroom. Her final moments, captured in terrible clarity, brought several jurors to tears. The confusion in her voice, the escalating terror, the sound of true love shattering against cruel reality. The defense tried to paint it as an accident, a lover's quarrel gone tragically wrong. But the evidence told a different story. Surveillance footage from hotels across Europe showed his pattern. The careful selection of victims, the calculated romance, the precise moment he would vanish, leaving only empty safes and broken hearts behind. Isabella's case was different, only because she had dared to share her happiness. Her last Instagram post, projected onto the courtroom screen, seemed to watch over the proceedings like a digital ghost. The comments section had become a memorial, a warning, a rallying cry for change in how we think about online privacy and romance in the digital age. On April 28, 2023, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Eric James Blackwood was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. The judge's sentence was unequivocal: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But the true resolution came in the changes that followed. Isabella's story sparked international discussions about online dating safety. Social media platforms introduced new verification systems. Support groups formed for romance scam survivors. Her brother David established the Isabella Morrison Foundation, dedicated to helping women recognize and escape fraudulent relationships. Isabella's Instagram account remains active, maintained by her family as both a memorial and a warning. Her last post, the one that cost her life, now has a pinned comment from Detective Walsh. Sometimes the most dangerous red flag is the one that looks like romance. In his maximum security cell, Eric James Blackwood finally has what he always claimed to want: complete privacy. No phones, no cameras, no carefully curated images to maintain. Just four walls and decades to contemplate how his obsession with remaining unseen ultimately made him unforgettable. And in Boston, Isabella's design studio has been transformed into a cooperative workspace for women entrepreneurs. Above the entrance, a vintage mirror hangs with an inscription that reads, "Look closely at reflections. They reveal what photographs sometimes can't."